We really wanted to start out our day big today, and we're doing that by having the co-author and co-researcher of the CDC Kaiser ACE study with us today, Mr. Rob Anda. Now, I know Rob really doesn't need any introduction because a lot of us are very familiar with his background, but I do want to just share some highlights with you. Dr. Anda graduated from Rush Medical College in 1979 and received his board certification in internal medicine in 1982. In 1984, he completed a fellowship in preventative medicine at the University of Wisconsin and received a master's degree in epidemiology. He was subsequently accepted into the Epidemic Intelligence Service at the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention in Atlanta. Now, he also spent some time here in Michigan on assignment with the Michigan Department of Public Health. Now, following his ACE study publication, Dr. Anda spent additional time consulting with the CDC and has now devoted his time to ACE Interface. That's a company that's created to assist in the awareness and training on adverse childhood experiences. As we know, Michigan ACE Initiative has contracted with ACE Interface to conduct all of the master training. I have been so enlightened by the ACE initiative. I want to tell everyone about it. I'm super excited to be here with you all day long today. Please welcome to the stage the master of all of this, Dr. Rob Anda.
Wow, thank you. You didn't need to know all that stuff. I want to say I've realized I've come full circle here. I cut my teeth as an epidemiologist here in 1984 at the Michigan Department of Public Health. The first time that department was actually beginning to work extensively on chronic disease issues that really trained me how to think about preventing chronic disease and the complexity of that kind of work that helped me to do the ACE study. So I'm really grateful to the state of Michigan to be back here to do that. And I'm really grateful to Rick Murdoch and Lisa Farnham for doing what they're doing with the Michigan ACE Initiative. I believe that this initiative is going to be an example for the rest of the country. The strategy that they employed behind this, and now having 5 cohorts of trainers that we use using the ACE Interface curriculum is really incredible. I can't tell you how wonderful it is to see so many trainers come together at one place at one time and see the energy. My colleague, Laura Porter, would you stand up, Laura? Laura is the real, Laura is the real genius behind ACE Interface, so I just try to follow her around and learn from her while we teach this. But 5 cohorts of people, and the concept of this is this information that we're teaching about adversity and the way it plays out in public health, I believe is the fundamental information that every person has the right to know. That gives every person the opportunity to make their lives better, to make the lives of their children better, the lives of the people they serve in their service systems better, and to reduce the burden of public health problems for the next generation. And the fundamental approach is playing out here in the state of Michigan. And I want to tell you a quick little story. I was in Traverse City about 3 or 4 years ago, and they did a keynote, and there was a really special person in that audience. And I was thinking, why are we here today? I'm thinking, no, how did we get here today? We got here because of Rick Murdoch's wife, Sonia. Sonia, would you stand up? No, really. Thank you, Sonia. We're here because Sonia very, very nicely needled Rick into getting involved in this initiative. And it's amazing how, these things happen, the serendipity of people coming together, and things flow out from that. And this, thank you, Sonia, for doing that. We have 5 cohorts of master trainers, and I know many of them are here today. They, in turn, the idea of this rollout is then they teach other people to teach this information in community, and we call those community champions. And if you would, I'd like all of the master trainers and community champions to stand up so that you can be recognized and we can see how many people we have that are taking this to the state of Michigan. So that's enough of hearing from me. We want to get to our keynote speaker. I'm really pleased to introduce Dr. Christina Bethell, who's going to do our keynote address. She works extensively in the area of childhood adversity and thinking about ways that we can prevent and mitigate that. She's the director of the Child and Adolescent Health Measurement Initiative at Johns Hopkins University. And most recently, she was a lead author in an article regarding family resilience and connection, flourishing in children, and how that interrelates with adverse childhood experiences. And I'd also like to add that Christina is one of our master trainers. She was in a training in the state of Maryland, I believe last year or the year before. So she's here to provide important information regarding our collective challenge in addressing adverse childhood experiences. So please join me in welcoming Christina to the stage.
Good morning. Believe it or not, this is the first time I've been in Michigan when I wasn't just going through the airport. However, I did, do you have my slides up? Do I just press that? Okay, great. However, I did go to the University of Chicago for my PhD, and I looked at Michigan quite a lot. And this is sort of what it looked like to me. So I've been so inspired. I feel very inspired right now, actually, being in your presence and recognizing each of you and why you're here. I'm imagining that for whatever reason, it's coming from that place inside that calls all of us to what's possible and to our best. So I'm very honored to be in a room of people who've made that choice and are making that investment. And so I want to start with a little poem, just one stanza of a poem. And it goes like this. It's called Transfixed, and it's a poem that wrote me one day. So it's just one stanza. So one day, the glacier said quite kindly to the sea, I would never want to be like thee. Like this, I can be my own earth, my own sky. Were I to melt, surely I'd die. Such powers you have, the sea answered back, and she meant every word, for there was nothing he lacked. Rather, he had just one thing to shed, the fear of the melting, the mistaken dread. And I think we're living in a time where we're realizing that we've had a lot of mistaken dread to meet what we've lived and what is here, the pain and the promise, and that by meeting it, we heal, not by denying it. So bless the hearts of everyone, Dr. Anda and everyone. There's been a lot of pain in talking about the obvious so that we can be here and really give it our best to reclaim ourselves. So I would say our feelings are our superpowers, and that we won't get through this without reclaiming our emotional well-being, intelligence, and understanding the social and emotional roots of our well-being. So that's kind of what we're talking about. And when you talk about that and translate it into things like how do you spend money, train people, and measure, it's challenging, but let's have some fun with it, and I think we all are. So I have no disclosures. I know some of you are doing CME, so I need to say that. However, I do have one disclosure, which is I believe that well-being is upon us because we're waking up and because it's within and between us. So much of what we require is ourselves and each other. And now we have science and lived experience connected up with some pretty good policy scenarios that allow us to start to be creative. So to me, this is a perfect storm, and that I think it's really possible for us to make some big changes for our own generation and those to come, and that we owe that to ourselves and each other, and that ours is a social brain. So the medicine is basically saying ours is a social brain. Developmental trauma, which occurs throughout life when we aren't met in life with that safe, stable, nurturing relationship, is a matter of public health, and therefore the things that we know are essential to healing that and turning the tide on that are also matters of public health. And when I look out at this room, this is a big enough room to change this state. And this state is a big enough state to change the country and the world. So I'm really excited about this future daily news that will be all over the country on how Michigan moves from awareness to resilience and flourishing for children, families, and communities. So I want to talk for a minute about flourishing, and then I'll talk a little bit about how that maps with the adversity. So many of you may know the World Health Organization defines health not as the absence of disease. So we know that you can have many illnesses and actually flourish, and have many and not have any illnesses and not be flourishing. And I would say the same thing about kindness and connection that is safe and stable, that the absence of cruelty is not the presence of kindness, that we actually have to be intentional if we want to be well. We have to be intentional if we want to create safety. It's not enough to just not do overt harm. It's not enough just to take away disease. I'm not sure we could, even if we tried, without first bringing up our sense of possibility and flourishing. And health operates on a dual continuum. So there's a lot of studies, some of them actually done here in Michigan, on how the absence of illness is not the presence of flourishing, and that you can have both, just like I said. And there's a study that this is on adults, and hasn't been done quite yet on children, showing that the absence of the positive, these qualities of flourishing, I'll say a little bit more about in a second, really have a huge prediction on all-cause mortality. So death decreased by as much as 62% over a 10-year follow-up for a longitudinal cohort who were not flourishing, which represents 8 in 10 U.S. adults not meeting criteria on that. And I'm sorry to say that, but every time Gallup does a poll, we have really high rates of people reporting that they're not feeling meaning in their life or hope and things like that. So we really need to ask ourselves, is that something we can do something about, and can we do something about ACEs without doing something about that first? Or, recognizing that's kind of what we're up to. And this stood even after you adjusted for all the illnesses that people had. So the absence of flourishing being a key thing. We also know, and you may or may not know, but a lot of people don't, that the death rates in America are going up compared to other countries. I have a pointer, but I'm not sure if I can really use it. But this, you can see this is the United States, and these are all the other European countries anyway. And what we're dying from are the diseases of despair. And this is really diseases of despair being mental illness, alcohol abuse, and so on. So, and we know that links to toxic stress. So that's an important thing to observe. And in a way, we seem to be a little bit not in touch with reality about how we're doing, because it can bring us down. But I think that there's a little bit of needing to see this. So hopefully we'll rise up and say, whoa, we can do better than this, especially since the diseases of despair really are something we can make an impact on. So Rick asked me to say a little bit more about what I mean by flourishing. There was a piece in JAMA a couple months ago on that for adults. Again, there are scales that assess flourishing, and they vary in different ways. But basically, they look at 6 key elements: having a sense of meaning in purpose in your life, having an ability to stay engaged and have positive relationships, to have a sense of capacity, there's something you have to offer, and self-worth, which is very deep, and we could go on all day about what that means, and a sense that you have contributed. So these are some of the core elements. And the one that is, the last one is positive emotions, is the least likely to be consistently measured across flourishing models, because we know that our emotions change in many ways, but we can still have a sense of meaning, purpose, engagement as we ride the tide of life's natural ups and downs. So flourishing isn't about running through the fields feeling blissful. That can be part of it, but it's really about staying here, staying present, staying with a sense of meaning and hope as life emerges every day and changes. So for child flourishing, we haven't measured a lot of this, and Rick said, or Dr. Anda said, about 20 years ago, we started trying to measure adverse childhood experiences for children since the ACEs study had come out, and it took about 15 of those years to get a permission on a national survey to be able to measure this, so getting through a lot of hoops to be able to ask parents and figure out how to do what would be valid. So I have some data on that. And so I think of flourishing in three ways. The flourishing of the remembering self is, up till now in your life, how satisfied are you? And we often ask these things on surveys. That's what's on the Burfus, I think. Then the flourishing of the experiencing self. Like today, how are you feeling? Are you feeling well? Are you feeling happy? Do you have positive emotions? And then there's the flourishing of the requiring self. Like, do I have my needs met? Can I get by in life? This is a very important aspect of flourishing. And these tend to be the aspects of flourishing that get measured and rolled up together to be called well-being. But I'm very interested in the flourishing of the living and relating self. How am I actually relating to my life with that sense of enduring meaning, purpose, and engagement as life moves? And so that's sort of how we ended up measuring it more in the National Survey of Children's Health for children. And like I said, these all taken together is a lot of what makes up well-being measures. So for the National Survey of Children's Health, how are Michigan children doing on three basic indicators of flourishing? So the three things that are measured in the National Survey are really indicators that children are on a path toward flourishing given their developmental state. Do they demonstrate being curious and interested in learning new things? Not just school, but just sort of engaged in life, looking, interested, and curious. You can observe that. You can sense that. And it had to be things you could sort of observe. The other is persisting. Does a child, when they start a task they choose, and it starts to be a little more complex, can they stay in the game a little? Do they persist to try? Do they try, or do they give up super easily, to use a technical term? And then finally, a cross-cutting thing is staying calm and in control when faced with a challenge. And I'm not talking about the developmentally appropriate ways that plays out, but really being able to have small daily things like not getting something that you thought you wanted to eat and being able to, kind of roll with it. Like you might be a little irritated, but you don't completely shut down or start acting out in ways that are very, very out of keeping with what it is that's going on. These are cross-cutting aspects. So there are three things, and they map to each of the aspects of flourishing that I just named to you in ways that would require a week to explain in terms of how the math was done, but we worked with Child Trends and many others to define the three things. So they are mapped to each of these from a research point of view. Okay, so now that I'm done with that, I was very happy to see Harvard Business Review do a review of leaders and say, what are the qualities of leaders when you're an adult that really represent excellence and being able to make a difference in the world? And they define leadership really as making a positive difference. And it's the same kind of things. It's a curiosity, which births insight, and you can have insight when you're open and curious, in staying engaged and having determination. So Harvard Business Review is behind us too. All right, so how are we doing in Michigan on these three aspects? So about 37% of your children, and this is on school age. If I added all the 0 to 5 as well, which I have, it would add too much to this talk, so I'm going to focus on school age children, meet all three of these criteria. And so I can show you the data that if you don't meet all three, you're much less likely to engage in school and many other things. So the 3 is a low bar. If we added more variables, the rates would go down. So it's approaching 40%, which is what it is in the country. And it doesn't vary as much as you think by income or insurance type, which is a marker sometimes for income. So we see about 35% in Michigan for publicly insured and 37% for your privately insured. So there's a pretty narrow window in the how school-age children are doing in terms of flourishing, regardless of their sort of income dynamics in the state. And I think that's important because it makes it a population-based issue. So how about ACEs? So I'm not going to talk a lot about ACEs because you've been immersed in that, but we do have some data on children for your state that I thought might be a complement to what you're going to be getting a lot of detail on around adults. And of course, we know that ACEs impact all of these adult health factors, and now we're getting more and more data now that we have it, that it's a similar trajectory for children. So let's look at Michigan. So I took the Spartan Stadium. How many have been to the Spartan Stadium? Okay. I'm trying to figure out my Michigan here. And about 46.6% or 1.01 million children in Michigan have one or more ACEs. And if we reduce it down with, Laura and I have been looking at reducing it down just to the ones that overlap with the CDC. There are some additional ones we add for kids and explain it and in a paper if you want to read it. It's 33.2, but the dynamics don't change that much in terms of the outcomes. So that's 12.5 Spartan stadiums filled up with children. And about 22% have two or more ACEs, where we really see like a triple or almost triple rates of emotional mental behavioral problems and already having chronic illness. So we're seeing it very early in children. But only 7.3 times is the Spartan Stadium filled up with children who are flourishing. And then also, how far would a line of school buses go? So if you filled school buses up with children and lined them back to back, how far across your state would that go? So about 140 miles for one ACE and about 66 miles for two or more. And the reason I do this kind of thing is because it makes it living. And I suggest that when you use your data, you make it living and give people an anchor for it. So we know that talking about ACEs is more than a courtesy alert. I get these on my dry cleaning often saying, "You're sorry, we found a spot, but we can't get it off." That's not what we're talking about. With ACEs, we have a lot of hope. And for one thing, we know that if we learn about the symptoms of ACEs, they start looking a lot like the symptoms of emotional mental behavioral problems. And then we diagnose early, maybe medicate, and we miss an opportunity to really see whether or not there are interventions, especially with children who we know are over-medicated and have a lot of mental health issues, but they fall along this continuum of what happens when we come out of our window of tolerance, because if we have trauma, our window of tolerance is not as wide. We can't handle even daily life stresses as well. So little things can send children all over the place, and even adults on a different day from one to the next. So resilience is not a stable thing, right? It's growing and changing. So, but instead, we really diagnose. So what we do, this is what we find in the national survey about what proportion of children with 4 or more ACEs are actually formally diagnosed with a mental, emotional, or behavioral health problem. And it's about 40%. And these are stable rates across income groups. So regardless of whether you're in 400% of poverty and above, which is the highest poverty level we measure, or below poverty, the rates are very, very much the same, and statistically actually not different. So rich or poor, we have an issue again. And we have a question that I ask, is chicken and egg question. Is it the ADHD or is it trauma? And how can we start to change our systems to find that out and not end up labeling children when we actually can intervene with some practices and skills and then the family? So I think this is a question we have. We obviously don't have the answer, but for me it's very important when you look at children who demonstrate this one quality of resilience, of being able to stay calm and in control when faced with a challenge, which is something we can teach children. It's harder or easier for some, but there is a lot of that can be done, that given that they have higher ACEs, their rates of diagnoses are much lower. And it sort of is a chicken and egg thing, but I think there's an opportunity calling out for us to really help our children. We know that the beds in hospitals, for children's hospitals, that are growing the fastest are our mental health beds. So what about the intersection between flourishing and ACEs? Well, it's kind of what you would expect, that lower flourishing for higher ACEs. However, there are about about 20-something percent, 27% in the Michigan for 2 or more ACEs who are flourishing, in the nation. This is your Michigan data. And the nation. But notice that only about 43% with no ACEs are meeting these criteria. So what does that tell us? I think we have a syndemic on our hands, that there's enough adversity and enough that's happened in our population that we're not proactively promoting positive health. And we call out ACEs, which is important, but the truth is we have a larger, what they call beyond an epidemic, sort of a syndemic kind of factor going on. So it's lower, but there are 20%, 24% in Michigan with 4 or more ACEs who are meeting these basic flourishing criteria. So I look a lot at positive deviance. What's that about? We're going to talk about that. And again, once you have 2 or more ACEs, regardless of household income, your flourishing rates are low once you have 2 or more ACEs. So high income, low income. And again, I'm trying to really keep that as a conversation so we don't end up setting policy that ends up pigeonholing a high rate that represents a small proportion of the population when we know that the whole population is really at play and we all need to be in this together. So the possibility is great. What's the problem? So initial studies on population health prove that food, shelter, clothing is very important, and we're still dealing with that in many ways, and I hope that we continue to address fundamental causes of adversity related to not having food, shelter, and clothing. And 1 million years later, we now know that relationships matter, and that the fundamental, our biology, our psychology, our identity, our beliefs, and what guides our lives and our relationships that pass on through generations really is guided a lot by family connection, feeling safe and trusting relationships, and what happens in our bodies and our brains and in our ways of being when we don't have that. So after 1 million years, we have learned something, and it really does rewire our sense of Maslow's hierarchy. So there's some studies on how people are mobile out of poverty, or who can start taking advantage of the opportunities that are provided, which is hard to do when you've had a history, historical history, family history, or personal history of adversity. It can be hard even to take advantage of people who were trying to help you. Like that's not really the way we're going to solve it. We have to really bring forward a sense of hope and belonging, and that's really where the social connection is absolutely mandatory. Also, in World War II, they started actually studying resilience. Why is it that some children did better than others who were a part of that war? And Anne Maston, who is one of my heroes, has written a lot on this. One of her books is called Ordinary Magic. And, I haven't talked with her, but I call it ordinary magic because it's ordinary day-by-day things about how we are with each other. And the choices we make moment by moment really are the things that add up to our well-being or our lack of well-being. And so relationships are the fundamental core of all of our adaptive systems. And it's both in the family, teaching that to children, to having their own relationship with themselves, to be socially engaged, to ask for what they need, to feel their feelings, not shut down, and learn these things. So it's very important. And then, of course, at the community level to support that. So it's a 3-tiered thing, but relationships are the core. So how are we doing in this area? So we also, this last year, after another 10 years, were able to measure family resilience on the National Survey of Children's Health. So there are 3 main components of an index that we created that was put into the health affairs paper that Dr. Anda said. So one is family resilience, and there are very basic qualities of resilience, like, do you feel hopeful when things are hard? Do you reach out and feel like you have places to go if you have a problem? That kind of thing. Are you willing to reach out? It's sort of, if you need something. There are 4 basic things. And then parent-child emotional connection, which is an item that you're not going to really, if you just read it, necessarily understand why it's valid. But we did a lot of work because we couldn't pick very much. It's like $250,000, I understand, for every item on the survey. So you end up getting squeezed into a small number. But this is where there are parents who are positive reporters. So anything you see here is going to be an optimistic view on whether they, how well they communicate with their child about things that really matter. And everybody, when you interview them, know what that means. That means things that are worrisome, things that are hard to talk about. So when we're talking about things that really matter, we're talking about things that we just maybe might just want to ignore and pretend they're going to be okay. And it's really whether you do that proactively with children that is such a powerful indicator. And the last is parents. Again, positive bias. Most parents are going to say, I'm fine. There's a lot of shame in saying I'm not fine. But there is a large cohort of families that will say, I am not doing well. I am not handling being a parent well. This is hard. Not just normal hard, this is really hard. So we know children are at risk when their families lack resilience, that they're not having basic aspects of connection in daily communication and coping. So what does it look like? Here's what it looks like nationally. About half, 48% of families are meeting these criteria for family resilience and connection. And in Michigan, figure out the thing here, it's very similar. It's exactly the same. So pretty much. So that's interesting. That's even interesting. You start to see these patterns epidemiologically, and you think, there's something going on in our country. There's a lot of variation in most measures. There's less variation in this one, which is really interesting. So that's how we're doing. And yet what we know is when families do exhibit these qualities of resilience and connection and coping, that children do much better, much more likely to flourish. And we stratified by all ACEs levels, 4 or more, and the odds are exactly the same. So even if you have really high ACEs, if we can find a way to support families, and is it possible? Do you think it's a catch-22? Can you build resilience even though you have adversity? I think that's why we're here, right? We believe that. But a lot of people will say, oh, well, you can't do that. That's what ACEs is. And it's not true. They co-occur. They co-occur in your life and in my life. And on any given day, I can list everything that's hard and I can list everything that's beautiful. And so we have this opportunity if we want to take it. And it's also true for adults. So we analyzed the Burfus data in Wisconsin that included positive childhood experiences. And I think some of your data from here in Michigan is going to be presented later. You also included some of these items. So basically, and the CDC, Dr. Anda in their study did include some family strengths as well. So when we have family strengths, people looking back on their childhood, just like they do on ACEs, but report positive childhood experiences, how predictive of that is to their health and well-being. And so we examined that. And basically, it operates on a cumulative score measure, just like ACEs. This is what is the prevalence of depression by each of the items in the positive childhood experiences index that we were playing with, and by cumulative score. And it's actually more predictive than ACEs. So if you have 0 to 2 of these positive childhood experiences, about half have a diagnosis of depression or report having have depression or 14 or more days of poor mental health. And so this is also true at every level of ACEs. So this effect holds up at every level of ACEs. And you're less likely to report that you have high levels of positive childhood experiences if you have higher levels of ACEs, but many people do. And then again, can we foster this in families now, given that we know how powerful it is? And the same thing for looking at whether adults report getting the social or emotional connection that they need, which we know is such a huge factor for adulthood, that the lack of the positive in childhood is more predictive of the lack of having emotional social support as adults. When we include the positive childhood experiences in our model, the ACEs effect goes away. Now, that doesn't mean ACEs don't matter, because a large portion of people who have higher numbers of ACEs don't have positive childhood experiences, right? So I don't mean to say that. It's just that for those who do, and there's a cohort and we can figure out more about why, they are much more likely as adults to have this. So it's definitely, and then of course in turn that all feeds into the other health problems we know that adult social and emotional support are very connected to. So this is a little bit, that's the main data story. I'm going to come back to it, but now I just want to pose a question. So we have at least 50 years of solid research on the importance of early life attachment and connection and what happens in the disruptions of safe, stable, nurturing relationships. All the way, neurons to neighborhoods in the year 2000. Who remembers neurons to neighborhoods? And we thought the world was going to change. We're still working on just getting that into the psyche and into the prioritization of our basic social programs and our businesses and our communities. So we have a lot going on. What's the problem? So obviously there's a cultural problem. First of all, we don't really talk about well-being and flourishing as our goal. We don't have a culture of health, as the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation would say, valuing health. We value the absence of disease. And I don't know if any of you know who Atul Gawande is, but he gave a talk recently on a revelation that he had about how we spend all of our time trying to help people not die when we know we will all die, and almost no time trying to figure out what would make your life worthwhile and how can we support that. Not only because that has value in itself, but because that's probably the best way to deal with the illness that you do have and that motivate the self-care that is needed and all of those things. So we have a cultural problem. And we also have a cultural problem for children where we need to actually, if we're going to turn this around in a couple generations, we have to focus on youth who before they have children, and young parents and children, but we do not value children in this country. Even with all of our data, if you look at how we spend our money, we don't value that. So we have a very big bias in our policies. And then we have a political problem, which is very related to that, is we have a tertiary care system that was grown up in an age where people died a lot from, problems that we now have figured out how to fix, and now we still have the tertiary system, and it's found a way to keep itself going and not necessarily trying to prevent the things that we know if we really worked hard we could cut a lot of costs in the medical system, but then we'd spend the money somewhere else, and that all those political dynamics are going on. And it's a fun thing to talk about, but we need to own it, that it's scary to foster well-being because there are systems and large sums of money that will not be coming in. Rick, you asked me last night, what would we do if people really realized what causes inflammation in the body and we all started eating healthier? I mean, big industries would go away. So we have to deal with this and understand that everyone's afraid to change for the positive. And then finally, I would say that this, what I call we are the medicine shift, if you look at all the neurosciences and epigenetics and practices and how many people have read The Body Keeps the Score, these practices, which we actually are, like Sonia with the VA and your work, are really what's helping people, are kind of weird, right? Aren't they just kind of a little weird? So I bundle them into three big buckets. One is time in practices. The practice of being able to tolerate being in your own skin, expand your window of tolerance, and it's a learned experience. Some people use mindfulness practice, yoga, but that time in is like flossing your teeth, flossing your brain. We need practices for this. Time with, belonging, real belonging, not just hanging out, but really a felt sense that we're connected, which is a felt sense. You can feel it, and when you feel it, usually a lot of really good things go on in your brain and your body. If they hooked you up to a machine, you'd be all lit up. And when you're not having it, you think you're belonging, but you don't really feel that you belong. So when we ask people, do you feel seen and heard and that you belong? People know what that means. And in the American Family Physicians Group, they're going to be naming whether the patient feels heard, seen, or belonged as a key quality indicator, because we know it opens the door to hearing, sharing, trust, respect, follow through, asking for help, and all the things that we often don't have. And then time for, which is a sense of I matter. And everything I do, the look on my face, whether I hear you and respond, matters. So it doesn't have to be something big. I don't know how many of you know the polyvagal theory, but how we get trained as children to feel safe or not based on how somebody's looking at us and touching us and leaning in. And we can sit flat with each other and think we're not doing any harm, but we are. Anyone with trauma is activated by the absence of that proactive openness and warmth and recognition. And so time for means everybody matters. Everybody matters every moment. And my biology and your biology are connected and reading each other. And how we do around our trauma has a lot to do with that. And of course, there's also bringing forth your gifts, your creativity, your art, your poetry, your brilliance at cooking, just your smile. It all matters. So, and then the other reason I think we have a problem is that it's complex. We have complex systems built up in one way that we need to change. Now, how do you do that? Obviously, you start with mindsets, and that's what a lot of is happening here, and it can go quick once the mindsets reach a critical mass, which I think you're doing. We can start to see a lot of things change, but that transformative change means getting clear about what's implicit. What are our implicit beliefs as a society? Like getting rid of disease is going to make us healthy. That's an implicit concept. We're playing it out. Getting aware and shifting our mindset is the first piece. But then we have to go to what I call the semi-explicit about this power dynamics. Okay, I'm going to no longer be the powerful, rich one because we've actually don't need that healthcare thing anymore. Now it's going to be the school and the PTA program that's going to get together, and they need our resources. But power dynamics from a place of equity, diversity, inclusion, and the history of racism and otherness that plagues us every day, every one of us, me included. It is part of our mindset that we separate ourselves from each other, and we need to feel like we're powerful, but really together is how we feel powerful. And breaking down that is a big piece of what I think is also going on in our society, and is a big piece of what is playing out with ACEs themselves. So how do we create the relationships and connections that allow us to share power and that value us all? I think this is key. And then finally, then translating it into the policies, the practices, the financing. How do we flow resources? So this is sort of the piece that is really challenging. So I'm going to share a little bit more about a national agenda that we did. There's a publication. There's several things. I'm going to fly through this a little bit, even though I think I have another 25 minutes. But let you know that these resources are available to you if they speak to you. So this is a little overview of a national agenda process that we started in really 2011, when we knew we were going to be getting the ACEs data nationally for children and youth, that we wanted to be able to have ourselves ready to find out if what we thought was true, and to publish fast as we could, and then bring all the sectors together that care about kids and to grapple with this. Do we have a problem? Are we ready? Can we start an initiative around children and youth around ACEs and pediatrics and child welfare in schools? And so this is just what it looks like. The academic pediatrics issue of September 2017 is where this is. But we led that issue and has 28 articles. It's open source, so you should be able to get all of it. Anybody here, because often you can't get things like that. So if you look at academic pediatrics September 2017, the supplement, the special issue, which Robert Wood Johnson helped us with, and several other smaller foundations, but it was a labor of love. And a lot of the articles are not from academics. Laura has an article in there with Rob, and Nadine Burke-Harris is in there, and also many other people, Jane Stevens from ACEs Connection. So if you want to have it, it's yours, it's free, and we want you to have it. But basically, I'm going to just go over a little bit about what's going to seem obvious, but the work that went on to get to these 4 little pillars of the agenda was a lot. So the first is obviously now what we already know: to educate about and translate the science of human development, flourishing, resilience, and ACEs. And it was ordered in that way on purpose. What do we know about what it means to develop well, human development, and the possibilities for flourishing and resilience, and what happens to that around ACEs? And so we didn't lead with ACEs in this conversation. Well, we did, but we didn't end up there. Cultivating the conditions for cross-sector collaboration and to incentivize shared action to address structural inequalities that hold things in place. Even if our hearts and minds want things to change, we still have the same systems and structures and rules and funding and performance metrics that keep things from changing. And so there's a lot in here, but we have a lot at the systems level to allow funding to be fungible, if that's a word anybody knows, be able to be used in the way that we think it needs to be used, and not always be constrained by what was. So we can't really collaborate. We can get together in a room and talk about it, but we can't really get the rubber hits the road unless there's some flexibility and shared sense of mission and shared measures, basically, just picking a couple things that we want to try to work on together. And then that related to that is to fuel launch and learn research, innovation, and implementation efforts that really require us to change funding. We are in an era of experimentation and innovation and creativity. There's some common elements and things that are guideposts, but we have to adapt this to every community, every family. We can't see it the way that we see a lot of other kinds of interventions. And so how we do our research even is more in a launch and learn kind of evolutionary, evolving, emergent way. And then finally, this was the most controversial, was really calling out that we fundamentally, at a cross-cutting level, need to restore and reward for safe and nurturing relationships. And also to engage at every level through that self, family, and what Laura calls community-led healing. And so this is written, we talk more about what it means, but these are the 4 pillars. And they kind of summarize up into this PERMA model that is not in the paper, but I gave acronyms because they help me, that is basically saying that we need a population-based strategy that integrates resources and sectors in terms of services, is relationship-centered in a very profound way, and that means something, multi-systems and advocacy-oriented, because we're not going to be able to change anything without all being advocates. Anybody in this field has to become an advocate, basically. And so we have 3 categories of actions that relate to policy And I'm not going to focus here, but there's something for everyone. We have EPSDT, hospital community benefit standards, lots of things. We have a report called Payment for Progress that looks at how do we pay for social and emotional determinants of health, social and emotional determinants of health, not just what we think of as social because they go together. Also addressing basic issues that now Medicaid's asking and health plans. What does this mean for coverage and coding, costs and payment, contracting, accountability, capacity and training, credentialing to make sure that people are able to get paid who are the community workers, the family-to-family workers that are so important, coordination and communication. So one thing that I did for this group, as well as some others, is how many of you know about the Integrated Care for Kids model that CMS is trying to put out, which is an opportunity for states to innovate around child health, and they want you to define risk. And so we tried to create a whole child risk index so that health systems start thinking about risk not just in terms of how much health care do they use, but really the risks that are bigger. And so combining having 2 or more health conditions, which is common, 2 or more ACEs, food insufficiency, families that report low resilience and low coping, and what does that look like? And so I just ran it for your state, and about 36% have none of these risk factors, but the rest have 1 or more. And so, when you think about services, the probabilities are that most people who are walking into any door you're walking into, especially for Medicaid, are going to have some of these risks. And we may know it, we may not know it, but they work synergistically, and it's important to define risk in a whole child way. So this is some of the follow-up action to the agenda. The other is, how many people know that 33 states have marijuana tax laws that are passed that are going to be starting bringing in a lot of money into states, specifically around substance abuse, mental health, and youth prevention and family support. So we worked with California State, who has about $1 billion a year, on a roadmap that is feeding off of the national agenda on how would you really, really direct expenditures and set out RFPs to really make sure that they're healing-centered, trauma-informed, racially just, culturally responsive approaches. And that's what it's going to take, because the whole war on drugs in America, also the rural areas, have extremely high rates. Our rates of substance abuse and mental health problems related to ACEs are very high. We need healing, and healing is prevention. And then this is just a little myth that came out of Child Trends, which is the analysis that's done around how we don't give any room to child welfare to change. So we have vision now. We have a lot of people coming into a room around foster care and child welfare and maltreatment and splitting families apart, but there's almost no room to actually make the change. So again, the advocacy of really creating the flexibility. Then the next section is really on leveraging current transformations. How many of you know medical home? Okay. So we have a lot of systems in place we want to leverage, because we're not going to just wipe the map clean. So I'm not going to go through this too much, but we have well child care. We have behavioral health integration, which is a big thing. And the factoids underneath this, I'll explain. And then coordinated complex care and social determinants of health efforts. All of these are happening all at the same time. They're very related. But ACEs is all over all of these. And so if we look at social determinants and not ACEs, if we do well child care and don't focus on these family factors, we're really missing the boat. So how do we integrate this into the systems that we already have? And get over the idea that I can use my administrative data and find out who people are. It's individual. It's individual, and it's different over time for the same child and family. So we need systems that are going to force us to talk to families and use data from people. So one tool that we've developed with HRSA that's free for anyone to use and get your own URL and stuff is called the Well Visit Planner, which basically takes the 15 well visits you're supposed to have in the first several years of life, English and Spanish, and give families a chance to say, how am I doing? What are my strengths? What are my priorities? Base that, use that for the visit, and they're always bringing up, as you can see here, the social and emotional factors that everyone thinks they don't want to talk about, that are scary to talk about. We have no missing values. Families are happy to share. They think it's important, and they'll tell you what they want to work on. You pull the thread of that, and then they'll follow in a trusting relationship to get help. So we have a lot to do to give the power back to actual people that we're trying to help. So they're setting the agenda, because then they're engaged, and when someone's engaged, then they can actually heal. You can't rewire another person's brain for them. You can't follow people home. We have to engage them and get inspired around their own needs and well-being. So this leads me to a big I'm going to be coming down the other side of my talk here about what I call your being, their well-being. And so a big piece in our national agenda was how important is it for leaders and caregivers and teachers to all really be focused on their own healing from trauma and ACEs and building their own positive health up. How important is that? And pretty much hands down, everyone said it was important, and then in a second said, but that'll never happen. How's that for a possibility mindset? How many things have ever happened in your life that you thought were never going to happen once you started angling in that maybe they could? So we really need to look at, if we're going to go from tinkering to transformation, we need to get pretty personal and intimate about how we're carrying, whether we want to or not, the trauma that we're trying to address. And so our own well-being is very important to the well-being of the children and families and those we serve. And this is a quote I love, that one mistake the arts would never make is to presume that a part of a role, like say a theater role, could be specified independent of the performer. There's another quote I like that's from your town. It's an auto guy. I can't remember his name, but he said that the effect of the intervention is dependent on the interstate of the intervener. So the success of an intervention is dependent on the interstate of the intervener. And so this concept is something, if you check it out, you might go, yeah, that makes sense. So what does it mean? So we need compassionate, dependable, trustworthy relationships, and people trust you when you're there and when you actually have compassion. So compassion is something you can learn, unlearn, have one day, not the next. It's intentional. We are built for it, and we don't consciously bring it forth. There's a new book called Compassionomics. It just came out a couple weeks ago, and I was already looking at a lot of the articles that are in it, but they put them all together. And one of the conclusions is 40 seconds of authentic connection and compassion with another person or a patient markedly reduces their anxiety, not just in that visit, but over time, and they're more likely to engage in all kinds of things that we want them to engage in. So, and it also helps the heart rate variability of the compassioner, if you will. So our well-being is enhanced when we can run compassion through our system. And how do we do that? That's a very important question. Also, the lessons from behavioral health integration. Larry Wiss is a colleague of mine. He's ran umpteen collaboratives across the country on integrating behavioral health with pediatrics. None of them have really succeeded. We still medicalize mostly. We're not getting there, and why? And his conclusion, which was not where he was when he and I first met in 2014, was it's about the relationships. The success is about the relationships for all the behavioral health integration projects. So we know something about healing relationships. I'm not going to go through this, but there's actually papers that define what is a healing relationship, what is a healing encounter, and how much does it depend on the actual, teacher, doctor, parent, of course. And these are the elements of appreciating power, valuing, and abiding. Sounds a lot like what I talked about before. And so this is inescapable. If we want to really make progress, to think about how we can cultivate these qualities that then create hope and trust and being known, and then catapult into the healing space of flourishing and resilience. What's probably not as intuitive, and what I often get, is compassion fatigue. How many of you heard of compassion fatigue, secondary trauma? And that is true. But there's a group called the Institute for Heart Math I did their work in 1994, so they've been around forever, and looking at what happens in the biology of a person when they're running compassion or appreciation or not. And one of the conclusions is that, we have burnout. We have huge burnout. If you look at the statistics on just mental health professionals, 40% admitting emotional exhaustion. It's probably even higher than that in some people, but I worked at a medical school, and pretty much everyone that came by would come into my office afterwards and talk, and they were like, I can't wait to get out of here. But they're going off to help the kids. They're burnt out. Why? And I'm going to say a lot of it is because we're not really having these human connections with our patients. And we think it takes time, but it's not that. It's about how you do what you're doing already. And the idea is that that burnout crushes compassion, not the other way around. Compassion doesn't crush burnout. You know what I mean? Compassion doesn't create burnout. Burnout crushes compassion, so it's a chicken and egg thing again. It's probably more likely that those people with low compassion, those are the ones that are predisposed to burnout. So it's protective to cultivate our own compassion for ourselves and each other as we go through this work. And everything you say and do creates an impact. So to me, that's empowering, because one of the things for professionals when I meet with them is that I don't matter. I'm just a secretary. I put everything in the EMR, electronic records. I fill out forms for people. But when you know that your very being is the thing that people are actually noticing and responding to, and what opens up inside of that, we all matter. This is a billboard in Richmond where we were just the other day. And the last really is around key short-term opportunities around data, which I'm not going to say much about, but we've liberated the National Survey of Children's Health data. A lot of the stuff I'm reporting on here, you can go and point and click in Michigan, get the variables, see how it varies by lots of subgroups. And then we have something called the National Measurement Research Network, which is noting that pretty much all of the measures we use across all of our systems, first of all, they are not shared. We don't share measures between Medicaid and child welfare and schools, even though we're kind of up to something similar. And most of them are still on access and utilization and nothing related to what I'm talking about today. So we can change that, and if we do, we will start to change some things. So we need to make the difference. So finally, in the last couple minutes, I'm going to get a little personal and say I believe we can interrupt trauma, but I don't believe it. I've learned it, actually. I've lived it. I've learned it. And I'm so pleased that the neuroscience and epigenetics are all talking about what's happening in your DNA when you meditate and, all of the practices around healing. And it really is possible, but it requires engagement, and that's scary. We can't be neutral bystanders to ourselves or to each other. And if we're going to rewire our brains, it's really through the process of noticing and choosing something different. And so if we talk about the wheel of awareness for any given thing that's happening inside of me, I see something and sense something, I think something, I feel something, I have a reaction, and then I have a choice. And all those things are happening all the time. And when we get into some of the mindfulness practices, you slow that down and you start to see it all, and then you can be proactive in life and engaged and intentional. And so this is just some quotes from Bruce McEwen, who did a lot of the original neuroscience of stress. How many of you seen Inside Out, the movie? I recommend you see it. I recommend you show it to kids. I'm going to talk about some kids. This is a little thing I do, but I'm not doing it with you today, which is this looks like a bunch of numbers. If I asked you to count from 1 to 50, you'd probably want to kick me out, right? But if I showed you that was the pattern, you might feel a little more kindly toward me, because you would be able to go, it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3. It's basically in a pattern. So when we see patterns, it's incredibly helpful. We also have lots of research on telling your story of trauma and creating a coherent narrative is healing. We have teaching teens that they're growing and they're not stuck the way they are all the time, reduces depression symptoms, and it stays that way. Laura's work has tried to put a lot of this together in home visiting, bless her heart, with the NEAR program, and I want an update on how that's going. But we have all of these practices, but we're suffering from a hard, easy cognitive bias. We think if it's relational, we think if it's about what's happening here or within me, it's easy. But I can go give you, a complex medical thing, and that's hard. I think it's the opposite. So we have that going on. And my experience, I'm going to share 2 kids that I work with, because I actually do teach mindfulness-based stress reduction and some trauma healing, and through the lineage of my own experience have offered that to other children, more like, being a CASA volunteer type thing. So this is a young child who looked on the left that way, and then that was a piece of art that he did when he was 16 about what it felt like in his wounded self, which he didn't even know he had until basically we talked about it, and it's right there. And this was the art he did. And then we said, well, what about your mask? How do you adapt? And that's the art he did. I'm split. I've got my I don't care, and I've got I'm your guy. And then he did an art on his essence. What's underneath all of that? What's beyond all of that you really could resource and bring up? This all happened in the same day. Here's a piece of art from Sweet Pea. I'm going to read Sweet Pea's poem in a minute. And she did this probably in a minute. Big head, all body of hearts, but kind of shrinking. And so you and I asked, what is that? And basically what came out on the page is, it's lonely here without my heart. What did I do wrong? So this is the internalization version of what happens in trauma. I'm bad. And I know I'll give more. pour yourself out some more, get more exhausted, get more inflammation, more migraines, can't sleep. This is a big part of how trauma plays out. So she had great heart, so she poured it all out. And that was her wounding. That's how her wounding almost killed her. So Sweet Pea has 8 ACEs, and I've worked with her on this healing journey for a number of years now. And there is a healing journey to going from victim to survivor to thriver to transcender. But even when we're transcending, we're still feeling everything that we've probably ever had. We just have more space for other things like resilience. It doesn't go away. Everything becomes a part of us. And the biggest part was activating her will to even participate. I don't care. No one cares. How could I? So you hear this, right? So how do we activate the will to be well, the self-care instinct? Because you can be all there with everything, and then people are like, just get away. Like, I work a lot with kids with special health care needs and their families, and they're like, I'm surviving. I don't want your help. Don't even make me hope. I don't want to hope. I got myself in a box. I'm good. And so how do we do that? And it's very, very key to activate that by reducing shame, is much of what I think that is. And we could do a whole piece on shame and that identity around shame. And then learning mindfulness, literally learning it, the science. You can teach this to kids, they know it. And being able to make the choice to go down the mindfulness path on what am I experiencing and what do I want to do about it around this wheel of awareness. Like, what happened? What did I think? What did I feel? What do I want to do? And what am I going to choose that is from my resources? So with all of that, Sweet Pea wrote a poem. And I'm just going to, the left side is her poem, and I'm going to read it to you because it's very, very short, and then I'm going to show you what she told me it meant to her, like each line, because it wasn't really obvious to me. Now, she calls it Only Begins. I call it a trauma-informed ode to epigenetics and the microbiome, because it's very deep. So it goes, I am in the world, and the world is in me, from my nose to my toes to my belly to my knees. What's in is out. What's out is in. Endings can't be endings because there's only begins, which is what she called mindfulness. Begins are like flowers that lean toward the light. When I'm aware of what is there, it's never really night. The scariest of scaries are just frights from before. I'm almost never afraid of what's actually at my door. That's a long journey. That's a long journey to take. So when I asked her what it meant, the first one is she said, I am impacted by my experience. It's not what's wrong with me, it's what happened to me. Okay, you all know that. The next is, my body and brain are all affected in seen and unseen ways. It's not what happened to me, it's how it impacted me. And to have compassion for how it's impacted her was a big thing. Like, I am impacted even if it's not obvious. So I need to love myself enough to know that and take care. My reactions in life are patterns that I learned before, many of them, especially when they're, the ones that aren't working for me. And they also impact others. So this is the corner we turn into radical responsibility, even though we were once victims, that we take responsibility for how our traumas impacted us, and we want to heal that too, because we start impacting others, and then the perpetuation happens. When I get quiet inside and notice the moment, I can meet each one new. Now that's heavy, but it starts to happen, and you feel it, and it comes outside of your practice, and you feel it in your life. I can choose to be present for my life and not stuck in what she called the trance of trauma, like where you're just operating on an automatic pilot. When I stay present, I can remind myself to focus on what's really happening and ask for help if I need it, something that would never happen, that you could even get help, and that I can ask for help, and I can be vulnerable and not feel shame, and that we're all in this together. Turns out my vulnerability with her was very important for her to feel that that was safe, right? Most of the time I'm safe. If not, I know what to do. And finally, the final one is noticing that I don't feel afraid all the time. So this is a big deal. She felt afraid all the time. She never knew she was afraid because she felt afraid all the time. It's like being a frog in warm water. You don't know you're boiling. And so that comes a time where you realize, oh, I'm actually feeling safe. That's new. And then you have the differentiation. All of biology is differentiate, integrate. Your cells are breaking apart, coming back together. The same thing with our inner beings. When you can get differentiated, oh, I've been afraid all this time, and now I have this other experience over here. I can notice now when I'm afraid and decide if I need to take action and not be caught by it for the rest of my life. So this is a big evolution. Like, how do you know you're coming out of trauma? Because when I'm mad, I know I'm mad, and I know whether I should be. You know, kind of those sorts of things. So I have 6 wishes as we walk away today. First is to free our brilliance by aligning our finances and what we value and what we pay for with what we care about. That's not happening quite yet. The next is take on transparency, to be more curious than afraid, to get the data we're getting today, to keep getting it, to get the feedback in the moment from each other, and be curious and interested in that feedback, not see it as a sense of failure, because we will fail, because we're evolving and learning. To become we ninjas. We're not that good at this we thing and the partnership thing, partly because we're carrying a lot of trauma and that destroys our abilities or we never learn them. So to be very, very gentle but very determined to become we ninjas, because everything happens through the portal of relationship and partnership, as you know. Prioritize possibilities, to actively and proactively elevate the positive, not as a way to not pay attention to what's not working, but as a resource and a lived possibility that we can have on the journey all the time, no matter what else is happening. And finally, then, to take on the trauma fully from this place of support. Obviously, this is not circular or linear. And then the last is to brave being, for all of us to really brave getting connected to our own selves as probably the most powerful resource we have to heal our families, to heal our organizations. And that's where, hang on, why is it going? Where love is a public health intervention. I wasn't sure if I was going to show this to you, but this is your brain on love, and there are people talking about it. You can unbundle it and see what it means, and so I'll leave you with that. Thank you for your time today.
Thank you, Dr. Bethell. You know, when we come here today like this, we are truly investing in ourselves. And one thing that I did take away was, you know, we need to spend time in our own body. We need to be present. We need to be in being. And we are here together today in that. We need to belong. And I think with having a faith and a trust in the ACE initiative, we do belong in this beautiful community that we're all here today. And time for becoming. Being educated, taking time to invest in yourself, which is what you are also doing here today. So time in being, time with belonging, and time becoming. So thank you for that message and all of your messages today. Can we give her another round of applause? Fantastic.